for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. I'm Darren Gibson. We have to talk about Grand Rapids has made the news again, not in a very good way. Migrant child workers working in food factories and other factories in Grand Rapids. We'll tell you about the New York Times blockbuster story. Also, we have to talk about a Tennessee Republican congressman basically lying about his college degree. We'll get to that in just a little bit. Plus, we've got a Hammer Time segment, and this might not be a surprise, so we'll get into all this in just a little bit. Before we get started with today's show, a couple of reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on Twitter at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Mastodon by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. And you can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Podvine, and Pandora by doing a search for Southpaws. And once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and YouTube accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern. And you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, KZGM in Kabul, Missouri, and KEPJ in San Antonio, Texas. So be sure to listen to us on your local Pacifica station. I want to get to our first story today. This is Hannah Dreyer writing for the New York Times. This is dated February 25th. It was almost midnight in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but inside the factory everything was bright. A conveyor belt carried bags of Cheerios past a cluster of young workers. One was 15-year-old Carolina Yock, who came to the United States on her own last year to live with a relative she had never met. About every 10 seconds, she stuffed a sealed plastic bag of cereal into a passing yellow carton. It could be dangerous work, with fast-moving pulleys and gears that had torn off fingers and ripped open a woman's scalp. The factory was full of underage workers like Carolina, who had crossed the southern border by themselves and were now spending late hours bent over hazardous machinery in violation of child labor laws. At nearby plants, other children were tending giant ovens to make Chewy and Nature Valley granola bars and packaging bags of Lucky Charms and Cheetos, all of them working for the processing giant Hearthside Food Solutions, which would ship these products across the country. After a shift in November, Carolina said, quote, "Sometimes I get tired and feel sick," end of quote. Her stomach often hurt, and she was unsure if that was because of the lack of sleep, the stress from the incessant roar of the machines, or the worries she had for herself and her family in Guatemala. She added, quote, "But I'm getting used to it," end of quote. This is something no 15-year-old should ever be used to. These workers are part of a new economy of exploitation. Migrant children who have been coming into the United States without their parents in record numbers are ending up in some of the most punishing jobs in the country, according to a New York Times investigation. This shadow workforce extends across industries in every state, flouting child labor laws that have been in place for nearly a century. 12-year-old roofers in Florida and Tennessee, underage slaughterhouse workers in Delaware, Mississippi, and North Carolina, children sawing planks of wood on overnight shifts in South Dakota. Largely from Central America, the children are driven by economic desperation that was worsened by the pandemic. This labor force has been slowly growing for almost a decade, but it has exploded since 2021, while the systems meant to protect children have broken down. The Times spoke with more than 100 migrant child workers in 20 states who described jobs that were grinding them into exhaustion and fears that they had become trapped in circumstances they never could have imagined. The New York Times examination also drew on court and inspection records and interviews with hundreds of lawyers, social workers, educators, and law enforcement officials. In town after town, children scrub dishes late at night. They run milking machines in Vermont and deliver meals in New York City. They harvest coffee and build lava rock walls around vacation homes in Hawaii. Girls as young as 13 wash hotel sheets in Virginia. In many parts of the country, middle and high school teachers in English language learner programs say it is now common for nearly all their students to rush off to long shifts after their classes end. Valeria Lindsay, a language arts teacher at Homestead Middle School near Miami, said, quote, "They should not be working 12-hour days, but it's happening here," end of quote. For the past 3 years, she said almost every 8th grader in her English learner program of about 100 students was also carrying an adult workload. These are children, for God's sakes, and they're working hard jobs. It's unreal. Migrant child labor benefits both under-the-table operations and global corporations, according to the New York Times. In Los Angeles, children stitch Made in America tags into J. Crew shirts. They bake dinner rolls sold at Walmart and Target, process milk used in Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and help debone chicken sold at Whole Foods. As recently as the fall, middle schoolers made Fruit of the Loom socks in Alabama. In Michigan, children make auto parts used by Ford and General Motors. The number of unaccompanied minors entering the United States climbed to a high of 130,000 last year, 3 times what it was 5 years earlier, and this summer is expected to bring another wave. These are not children who have stolen into the country undetected. The federal government knows they are in the United States, and the Department of Health and Human Services is responsible for ensuring sponsors will support them and protect them from trafficking or exploitation. But as more and more children have arrived, the Biden White House has ramped up demands on staffers to move the children quickly out of shelters and release them to adults. Caseworkers say they rushed through vetting sponsors. While HHS checks on all minors by calling them a month after they begin living with their sponsors, data obtained by the New York Times showed that over the last 2 years, the agency could not reach more than 85,000 children. Overall, the agency lost immediate contact with a third of migrant children. An HHS spokeswoman said the agency wanted to release children swiftly for the sake of their well-being, but had not compromised safety. Kamara Jones, the spokeswoman for HHS, said, quote, "There are numerous places among the process to continually ensure that a placement is in the best interest of the child," end of quote. Far from home, many of these children are under intense pressure to earn money. They send cash back to their families while often being in debt to their sponsors for smuggling fees, rent, and living expenses. Annette Pasalacqua, who left her job as a caseworker in Central Florida last year, said, quote, "It's getting to be a business for some of these sponsors," end of quote. Pasalacqua said she saw so many children put to work and found law enforcement officials so unwilling to investigate these cases that she largely stopped reporting them. Instead, she settled for explaining to the children that they were entitled to lunch breaks and overtime. Wow. Unbelievable. We're at this point here. They just gave up. They gave up. Sponsors are required to send migrant children to school, and some students juggle classes and heavy workloads. Other children arrive to find that they have been misled by their sponsors and will not be enrolled in school. The federal government hires child welfare agencies to track some minors who are deemed to be at high risk. But caseworkers at those agencies said that HHS regularly ignored obvious signs of labor exploitation, which the agency has disputed. In interviews with more than 60 caseworkers, most independently estimated that about 2/3 of all unaccompanied migrant children ended up working full-time. A representative for Hearthside said the company relied on a staffing agency to supply some workers for its plants in Grand Rapids, but conceded that it had not required the agency to verify ages through a national system that checks Social Security numbers. Unaccompanied migrant children often obtain false identification to secure work. In a statement, the company said, quote, "We are immediately implementing additional controls to reinforce all agencies' strict compliance with our longstanding requirement that all workers must be 18 or over," end of quote. At Union High School in Grand Rapids, Carolina's 9th grade social studies teacher Rick Angstman has seen the toll that long shifts take on his students. One who was working nights at a commercial laundry began passing out in class from fatigue and was hospitalized twice, according to Angstman. Unable to stop working, the student dropped out of school. Angstman said of the student that dropped out, quote, "She disappeared into oblivion. It's the new child labor. You're taking children from another country and putting them in almost indentured servitude," end of quote. He's right. This is basically slavery that nobody is being held accountable for. When Carolina left Guatemala, she had no real understanding of what she was heading toward, just a sense that she could not stay in her village any longer. There was not much electricity or water, and after the pandemic began, not much food. The only people who seemed to be getting by were the families living off remittances from relatives in the United States. Carolina lived alone with her grandmother, whose health began failing. When neighbors started talking about heading north, she decided to join. She was 14. She said, quote, "I just kept walking," end of quote. Carolina reached the U.S. border exhausted, weighing 84 pounds. Agents sent her to an HHS shelter in Arizona where a caseworker contacted her aunt, Marcelina Ramirez. Ramirez was at first reluctant. She had already sponsored 2 other relatives and had 3 children of her own. They were living on $600 a week, and she didn't even know Carolina. When Carolina arrived in Grand Rapids last year, Ramirez told her she would go to school every morning and suggested that she pick up evening shifts at Hearthside. She knew Carolina needed to send money back to her grandmother. She also believed it was good for young people to work. Child labor is the norm in rural Guatemala, and she herself had started working around the 2nd grade. One of the nation's largest contract manufacturers, Hearthside makes and packages food for companies like Frito-Lay, General Mills, and Quaker Oats. A Grand Rapids area plant manager told a trade magazine in 2019, quote, "It would be hard to find a cookie or cracker aisle in any leading grocer that does not contain multiple products from Hearthside production facilities," end of quote. And I bet the trade magazine is probably my biz. General Mills, whose brands include Cheerios, Lucky Charms, and Nature Valley, said it recognized the seriousness of this situation and was reviewing the New York Times findings. PepsiCo, which owns Frito-Lay and Quaker Oats, declined to comment. 3 people who until last year worked at one of the biggest employment agencies in Grand Rapids, Forge Industrial Staffing, said Hearthside supervisors were sometimes made aware that they were getting young-looking workers whose identities had been flagged as false. Nubia Malakara, a former Forge employee who said she also had worked at Hearthside as a minor, said, quote, "Hearthside didn't care," end of quote. In a statement, Hearthside said, quote, "We do care deeply about this issue and are concerned about the mischaracterization of Hearthside," end of quote. A spokesman for Forge Industrial Staffing said it complied with state and federal laws and, quote, "would never knowingly employ individuals under 18," end of quote. Kevin Tomas said he sought work through Forge after he arrived in Grand Rapids at age 13 with his 7-year-old brother. At first, he was sent to a local manufacturer that made auto parts for Ford and General Motors. But his shift ended at 6:30 in the morning, so he could not stay awake in school, and he struggled to lift the heavy boxes. Kevin said, quote, "It's not that we want to be working these jobs, it's that we have to help our families," end of quote. By the time he was 15, Kevin had found a job at Hearthside stacking 50-pound cases of cereal on the same shift as Carolina. The growth of migrant child labor in the United States over the past several years is a result of a chain of willful ignorance. Companies ignore the young faces in their back rooms and on their factory floors. Schools often decline to report apparent labor violations, believing it will hurt children more than help. And HHS behaves as if the migrant children who melt unseen into the country are doing just fine. Doug Gilmer, the head of the Birmingham, Alabama Office of Homeland Security Investigations, a federal agency that often becomes involved with immigration cases, said, quote, "As the government, we've turned a blind eye to their trafficking," end of quote. Gilmer teared up as he recalled finding 13-year-olds working in meat plants, 12-year-olds working at suppliers for Hyundai and Kia, as documented last year by a Reuters investigation, and children who should have been in middle school working at commercial bakeries. By the way, Hyundai says that they are no longer doing business with that parts supplier that was hiring underage workers. Gilmer added, quote, "We're encountering it here because we're looking for it here. It's happening everywhere," end of quote. Children have crossed the southern border on their own for decades, and since 2008, the United States has allowed non-Mexican minors to live with sponsors while they go through immigration proceedings, which can take several years. The policy, codified in anti-trafficking legislation, is intended to prevent harm to children who would otherwise be turned away and left alone in a Mexican border town. When Kelsey Keswani first worked as an HHS contractor in Arizona to connect unaccompanied migrant children with sponsors in 2010, the adults were almost always the children's parents, who had paid smugglers to bring them up from Central America. But she said that around 2014, the numbers of arriving children began to climb, and their circumstances were different. She said that in recent years, quote, "The kids almost all have a debt to pay off, and they're super stressed about it," end of quote. Again, these are children. She began to see more failures in the vetting process, adding, quote, "There were so many cases where sponsors had sponsored multiple kids and it wasn't getting caught. So many red flags with debt. So many reports of trafficking," end of quote. Now, just a third of migrant children are going to their parents. A majority are sent to other relatives, acquaintances, or even strangers, according to a New York Times analysis of federal data. Nearly half are coming from Guatemala, where poverty is fueling a wave of migration. Parents know that they would be turned away at the border or quickly deported, so they send their children in hopes that remittances will come back. In the last 2 years alone, more than 250,000 children have entered the United States by themselves. The shifting dynamics in Central America helped create a political crisis early in Joe Biden's presidency, when children started crossing the border faster than HHS could process them. With no room left in shelters, the children stayed in jail-like facilities run by Customs and Border Protection and later in tent cities. The images of children sleeping on gym mats under foil blankets attracted intense media scrutiny. The Biden administration pledged to move children through the shelter system more quickly. Javier Becerra, Secretary of Health and Human Services, told Congress in 2021, quote, "We don't want to continue to see a child languish in our care if there is a responsible sponsor," end of quote. His agency began paring back protections that had been in place for years, including some background checks and reviews of children's files, according to memos reviewed by the New York Times and interviews with more than a dozen current and former employees. Keswani, who stopped working with HHS last month, said, quote, 20% of kids have to be released every week or you get dinged, end of quote. Well, the kids are the ones that are getting dinged, having to work in these jobs. Concerns piled up in the summer of 2021 at the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the HHS division responsible for unaccompanied migrant children. In a July memo, managers said they were worried that labor trafficking was increasing and complained to their bosses that the office had become, quote, one that rewards individuals for making quick releases and not one that rewards individuals for preventing unsafe releases, end of quote. Staff members said in interviews that Becerra continued to push for faster results, often asking why they cannot discharge children with machine-like efficiency. According to a recording obtained by the New York Times, Becerra said at a staff meeting last summer, quote, "If Henry Ford had seen this in his plants, he would have never become famous and rich. This is not the way you do an assembly line." End of quote. This is a government official talking about children in this way, like they're an assembly line. Unbelievable. Jones from the HHS said that Becerra had urged his staff to, quote, "step it up. Like any good leader, he wouldn't hesitate to do it again, especially when it comes to the well-being and safety of children." End of quote. During a call last March, Becerra told Cindy Huang, the ORR director, that if she could not increase the number of discharges, he would find someone who could. That is according to 5 people familiar with the phone call. She resigned a month later. He recently made a similar threat to her successor during a meeting with senior leadership. That is according to several people who were present. While many migrant children are sent to the United States by their parents, others are persuaded to come by adults who plan to profit from their labor. Neri Kutzel was 13 when he met his sponsor over Facebook Messenger. Once Neri arrived in Florida, he discovered that he owed more than $4,000 and had to find his own place to live. Again, this is a 13-year-old. His sponsor sent him threatening text messages and kept a running list of new debts: $140 for filling out HHS paperwork, $240 for clothes from Walmart, $45 for a taco dinner. The sponsor wrote, quote, "Don't mess with me, you don't mean anything to me." End of quote. Neri began working until 3 a.m. most nights at a trendy Mexican restaurant near Palm Beach to make the payments. He said, quote, "The sponsor said I would be able to go to school and he would take care of me, but it was all lies." End of quote. Neri's father, Lionel Kutzel, said the family had become destitute after a series of bad harvests and had no choice but to send their oldest son north from Guatemala. The father said, quote, "Even when he shares $50 is a huge help. Otherwise, there are times we don't eat." End of quote. The father had not understood how much Neri would be made to work and said, quote, "I think he passed through some hard moments being up there so young." End of quote. Neri eventually contacted law enforcement, and his sponsor was found guilty last year of smuggling a child into the United States for financial gain. That outcome is rare. In the past decade, federal prosecutors have brought only about 30 cases involving forced labor of unaccompanied minors. That is according to a New York Times review of court databases. Unlike the foster care system in which all children get case management, HHS provides this service to about a third of children who pass through its care, and usually for just 4 months. Tens of thousands of other children are sent to their sponsors with little but the phone number for a national hotline. From there, they are often on their own. There is no formal follow-up from any federal or local agencies to ensure that sponsors are not putting children to work illegally. In Pennsylvania, one caseworker told the New York Times he went to check on a child released to a man who had applied to sponsor 20 other minors. The boy had vanished. In Texas, another caseworker said she had encountered a man who had been targeting poor families in Guatemala, promising to help them get rich if they sent their children across the border. He had sponsored 13 children. Bernal Cruz Munoz, a caseworker supervisor in Oregon, said, quote, "If you've been in this field for any amount of time, you know that there's what the sponsors agree to and what they're actually doing." End of quote. Calling on the hotline is not a sure way to get support either. Juanito Ferrer called for help after he was brought to Manassas, Virginia at age 15 by an acquaintance who forced him to paint houses during the day and guard an apartment complex at night. His sponsor took his paychecks and watched him on security cameras as he slept on the basement floor. Juanito said that when he called the hotline in 2019, the person on the other end just took a report. He said, quote, "I thought they'd send the police or someone to check, but they never did that. I thought they would come and inspect the house at least." End of quote. He eventually escaped. Asked about the hotline, HHS said operators passed reports on to law enforcement and other local agencies because the agency did not have the authority to remove children from homes. The New York Times analyzed government data to identify places with high concentrations of children who had been released to people outside their immediate families, a sign that they might have been expected to work. In Northwest Grand Rapids, for instance, 93% of children have been released to adults who are not their parents. HHS does not track these clusters, but the trends are so pronounced that officials sometimes notice hot spots anyway. Scott Lloyd, who led the resettlement office during the Trump administration, said he realized in 2018 that the number of unaccompanied Guatemalan boys being released to sponsors in South Florida seemed to be growing. He said, quote, "I always wondered what was happening there," end of quote. But his attention was diverted by the chaos around the Trump administration's child separation policy, and he never looked into it. The trend he saw has only accelerated. For example, in the past 3 years, more than 200 children have been released to distant relatives or unrelated adults around Immokalee, Florida, an agricultural hub with a long history of labor exploitation. In a statement, HHS said it had updated its case management system to better flag instances when multiple children were being released to the same person or address. Many sponsors see themselves as benevolent, doing a friend or neighbor a favor by agreeing to help a child get out of a government shelter, even if they do not intend to offer any support. Children often understand that they will have to work, but do not grasp the unrelenting grind that awaits them. 13-year-old Jose Vasquez, who works 12-hour shifts 6 days a week at a commercial egg farm in Michigan and lives with his teenage sister, said, quote, "I didn't get how expensive everything was. I'd like to go to school, but then how would I pay rent?" End of quote. Again, this is a 13-year-old worrying about paying rent. One fall morning at Union High School in Grand Rapids, Carolina listened to Angstman lecture on the journalist Jacob Rias and the progressive era movement that helped create federal child labor laws. He explained that the changes were meant to keep young people out of jobs that could harm their health or safety, and showed the class a photo of a small boy making cigars. He told the students, quote, "Rias reported that members of this family worked 17 hours a day, 7 days a week. The cramped space reeked of toxic fumes," end of quote. Students seemed unmoved. Some struggled to stay awake. Yeah, because they were probably working 12-hour shifts. Teachers at the school estimated that 200 of their immigrant students were working full-time while trying to keep up with their classes. The greatest share of Angstman's students worked at one of the 4 Hearthside plants in the city. The company, which has 39 factories in the United States, has been cited by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration for 34 violations since 2019, including for unsafe conveyor belts at the plant where Carolina found her job. At least 11 workers suffered amputations in that time. In 2015, a machine caught the hairnet of an Ohio worker and ripped off part of her scalp. After the most recent violation for an amputation, an OSHA official said the history of accidents, quote, "shows a corporate culture that lacks urgency to keep workers safe," end of quote. Underage workers in Grand Rapids said that spicy dust from immense batches of flamin' hot Cheetos made their lungs sting, and that moving heavy pallets of cereal all night made their backs ache. They worried about their hands getting caught in conveyor belts, which federal law classifies as so hazardous that no child Carolina's age is permitted to work with them. Hearthside said in a statement that it was committed to complying with laws governing worker protections. The statement read in part, quote, "We strongly dispute the safety allegations made and are proud of our safety-first culture," end of quote. Yeah, I'm sure they're also proud of their history of hiring child labor. They just don't admit to it. Federal law bars minors from a long list of dangerous jobs, including roofing, meat processing, and commercial baking. Except on farms, children younger than 16 are not supposed to work for more than 3 hours or after 7 p.m. on school days. But these jobs, which are grueling and poorly paid and thus chronically short-staffed, are exactly where many migrant children are ending up. Adolescents are twice as likely as adults to be seriously injured at work, yet recently arrived preteens and teenagers are running industrial dough mixers, driving massive earth movers, and burning their hands on hot tar as they lay down roofing shingles, according to reports from the New York Times. Unaccompanied minors have had their legs torn off in factories and their spines shattered on construction sites, but most of these injuries go uncounted. The Labor Department tracks the deaths of foreign-born child workers but no longer makes them public. Reviewing state and federal safety records and public reports, the Times found a dozen cases of young migrant workers killed since 2017, the last year the Labor Department reported any. The deaths included a 14-year-old food delivery worker who was hit by a car while on his bike at a Brooklyn intersection, a 16-year-old who was crushed under a 35-ton tractor scraper outside Atlanta, and a 15-year-old who fell 50 feet from a roof in Alabama where he was laying down shingles. In 2021, Carla Campbell, a Nashville labor lawyer, helped a woman figure out how to transport the body of her 14-year-old grandson who had been killed on a landscaping job back to his village in Guatemala. It was the second child labor death she had handled that year. Campbell said, quote, "I've been working on these cases for 15 years, and the addition of children is new," end of quote. In dairy production, the injury rate is twice the national average across all industries. Paco Calvo arrived in Middlebury, Vermont when he was 14 and has been working 12-hour days on dairy farms in the 4 years since. He said he crushed his hand in an industrial milking machine in the first months of doing this work. He said, quote, "Pretty much everyone gets hurt when they first start," end of quote. Charlene Irizarry, Human Resources Manager at Farm Fresh Foods, an Alabama meat plant that struggles to retain staff, recently realized she was interviewing a 12-year-old for a job slicing chicken breast into nuggets in a section of the factory kept at 40 degrees. Wow. Irizarry regularly sees job applicants who use heavy makeup or medical masks to try to hide their youth. She added, quote, "Sometimes their legs don't touch the floor," end of quote. Other times an adult will apply for a job in the morning, and then a child using the same name will show up for orientation that afternoon. She and her staff have begun separating other young applicants from the adults who bring them in so they will admit their real ages. Irizarry said the plant had already been fined for one child labor violation, and she was trying to avoid another. But she wondered what the children might face if she turned them away. She said, quote, "I worry about why they're so desperate for these jobs," end of quote. In interviews with underage migrant workers, the New York Times found child labor in the American supply chain of many major brands and retailers. Several, including Ford, General Motors, J.Crew, and Walmart, as well as their suppliers, said they took the allegations seriously and would investigate. Target and Whole Foods did not respond to requests for comment. Fruit of the Loom said it had ended its contract with the supplier. One company, Ben & Jerry's, said it worked with labor groups to ensure a minimum set of working conditions at its dairy suppliers. Cheryl Pinto, the company's head of values-led sourcing, said that if migrant children needed to work full-time, it was preferable for them to have jobs at a well-monitored workplace. Wow. Yeah, Ben & Jerry are going to get pissed off when they see this. It's unfortunate that they no longer have control over that company because they would never have allowed this. The Labor Department is supposed to find and punish child labor violations, but inspectors in a dozen states said their understaffed offices could barely respond to complaints, much less open original investigations. When the department had responded to tips on migrant children, it had focused on the outside contractors and staffing agencies that usually employ them, not the corporations where they perform the work. In Worthington, Minnesota, it had long been an open secret that migrant children released by HHS were cleaning a slaughterhouse run by JBS, the world's largest meat processor. The town has received more unaccompanied migrant children per capita than almost anywhere in the country. Outside the JBS pork plant last fall, the New York Times spoke with baby-faced workers who chased and teased one another as they came off their shifts in the morning. Many had scratched their assumed names off company badges to hide evidence that they were working under false identities. Some said they had suffered chemical burns from the corrosive cleaners they used. Not long afterward, labor inspectors responding to a tip found 22 Spanish-speaking children working for the company hired to clean the JBS plant in Worthington, and dozens more in the same job at meat processing plants across the United States. But the Labor Department can generally only issue fines. The cleaning company paid a $1.5 million penalty, while JBS said it had been unaware that children were scouring the Worthington factory each night. JBS fired the cleaning contractor. The New York Times found that many of the children who were working there have found new jobs at other plants. 17-year-old Mauricio Ramirez, who has found a meat processing job in the next town over, said, quote, "I still have to pay back my debt, so I still have to work." End of quote. It has been a little more than a year since Carolina left Guatemala, and she has started to make some friends. She and another girl who works at Hearthside have necklaces that fit together, each strung with half a heart. When she has time, she posts selfies online decorated with smiley faces and flowers. Mostly, though, she keeps to herself. Her teachers do not know many details about her journey to the border. When the topic came up at school recently, Carolina began sobbing and would not say why. After a week of 17-hour days, she sat at home one night with her aunt and considered her life in the United States. The long nights, the stress about money. She said, quote, "I didn't have expectations about what life would be like here, but it's not what I imagined." End of quote. She was holding a debit card given to her by a staffing agency, which paid her Hearthside salary this way so she did not have to cash checks. Carolina turned it over and over in her palm as her aunt looked on. Ramirez said, quote, "I know you get sad." End of quote. Carolina looked down. She wanted to continue going to school to learn English, but she woke up most mornings with a clenched stomach and kept staying home sick. Some of her ninth grade classmates had already dropped out. The 16-year-old boy she sat next to in math class, Christian Lopez, had left school to work overtime at Hearthside. Christian lived a few minutes away in a bare 2-room apartment he shared with his uncle and 12-year-old sister, Jennifer. His sister did not go to school either, and they had spent the day bickering in their room. Now night had fallen and they were eating Fruit Loops for dinner. The heat was off, so they wore winter jackets. In an interview from Guatemala, their mother, Isabel Lopez, cried as she explained that she had tried to join her children in the United States last year, but was turned back at the border. Christian had given his uncle some of the money he earned making Chewy bars, but his uncle believed it was not enough. He had said he would like Jennifer to start working at the factory as well and offered to take her to apply himself. Christian said he had recently called the HHS hotline. He hoped the government would send someone to check on him and his sister, but he had not heard back. He did not think he would call again. And why would they? This is the kind of treatment that they get. When you get despondent, you just give up. And that's what a lot of these kids have done. They've given up. I'll be controversial for a minute. Every one of these factories that does this ought to be shut down and made a public entity. That's right. Take it out of private hands and put it in the public's hands. It's about time, folks. Oh, you're a communist. I don't care. If it keeps children from having to work at the age of 12 or 13, I don't care what you call me. Because I've got names for you, too. I want to get to this. So Ottawa Impact is back in the news again. They have now made corrections for the previous Board of Commissioners about hiring the health officer, because the person that the previous commission hired is not the person that the current commission want to hire. Because they want to hire somebody who's an anti-vaxxer, COVID denier, doesn't believe in masks, doesn't believe in vaccines. He's a nut job. He is a psychotic, Christo-fascist nut job. And now we've got the Ottawa County Republican Party wanting to pass a resolution, and they're going to send it to the Ottawa County Board to make Ottawa County a Second Amendment sanctuary. The entire county. Folks, I'm going to say this again, and there are people out there that say, well, boycotts don't work. Bullshit. They work. So I am going to say this as clearly as I can to all of my listeners. Until these Christo-fascists are out of power, do not travel through Ottawa County. Most importantly, do not spend money in Ottawa County. Do not spend one single goddamn penny in Ottawa County, Michigan. If you're traveling from Chicago and you want to go to the beach, drive a little bit further north into Muskegon, because they got a beach too. Stay a little further south and go to South Haven. Guess what they don't have there? A bunch of nut jobs running the place. And I tell you what, I've got a direct plea to Governor Gretchen Whitmer. It is beyond time for Governor Whitmer to invoke the emergency manager law in Ottawa County and take over. These people do not know what they are doing. They need to have somebody over the top of them in control. Let's see how much hate mail I get from these nut jobs. I don't care. Threaten me, I don't give a f*** anymore. Tell you what, let's get to our next story here. This is Kimberly Crucy writing for the Associated Press. This is dated February 28th out of Nashville, Tennessee. U.S. Representative Andy Ogles said he was mistaken when he said he graduated with an international relations degree after a local news outlet raised questions over whether the Republican had embellished his education. Ogles said this week that he was not made aware of the mistake until he requested his transcript from Middle Tennessee State University to verify his degree. In a statement released Sunday, Ogles said, quote, "When I pulled my transcript to verify, I realized I was mistaken. My degree is in liberal studies. I apologize for my misstatement." End of quote. Earlier this month, WTVF television reported that Ogles had also called himself an economist, even though he only took one community college economics course. The station then raised questions over Ogles' claims that he has law enforcement experience and handled international sex crimes. When asked directly by WWTN's Dan Mandis on February 21st if the congressman had embellished his resume, Ogles said that people should, quote, "look at the body of someone's work," end of quote, to determine if he's an economist. He added, quote, "I had the privilege of my career. I've spent the last decade working on economic policy and tax policy, so you decide. At the end of the day, I don't care," end of quote. Ogles then clarified that he was a reserve deputy for a local law enforcement agency, which overlapped with his time working for Abolition International, a Nashville-based nonprofit that combats sex trafficking. Ogles said, quote, "Maybe I created some of the confusion, or maybe it was someone looking to write a story," end of quote. No, you're a goddamn liar. That's what you are. Ogles' statement released Sunday only addressed his college education, which he said he had to drop out of MTSU to help his family during a difficult time. He later returned as a non-traditional student and completed his remaining courses online. Ogles said, quote, "At the time, it was my understanding that I had completed my course of study in political science and international relations. Last week, I requested an official copy of my transcript and learned that I was actually awarded a broader degree in liberal studies with minors in political science and English." End of quote. The controversy comes after U.S. Representative George Santos of New York has faced numerous calls for his resignation after acknowledging he fabricated and at times lied about parts of his education, work experience, and even his family's own religion and history. Ogles, a former rural county mayor, won the Nashville-based congressional seat last year after largely avoiding the public spotlight and refusing to debate his Democratic opponent. Yeah, because he'd get called down on his bullshit. The strategy was successful largely due to the Republican-led redistricting process, which carved Nashville's congressional seat into 3 districts. Doing so provided enough cushion for a Republican to win. Yeah, because they have to lie, cheat, and steal to win. They gerrymander, they lie their ass off about their history, they'll do it all just to get power. Every single one of them. And if you don't figure that out, you better do it soon, or you better grow a brain and figure it out now before it's too late. And let's go to our next story here. Charleston, West Virginia. This is Leah Willingham writing for the Associated Press. This is dated February 27th. Listen to this, folks. West Virginia's Republican supermajority House of Delegates passed a bill Monday that would create a test for courts to apply when people challenge government regulations they believe interfere with their constitutional right to religious freedom. The bill passed after several Democrats expressed concern that the proposal could be used as a tool to discriminate against LGBTQ people and other marginalized groups. Democratic Delegate Joey Garcia also asked whether the proposed law could be used to overturn West Virginia's vaccine requirements, which are some of the strictest in the nation. One of the legislation's co-sponsors, Republican Delegate Todd Kirby, said those questions would be up to the courts to decide. The bill only provides a judicial test for interpreting the law. The Christian lawmaker, let me just call it correctly, the Christo-fascist lawmaker, provided some examples of instances when the government has, in his view, infringed on residents' religious rights. One example was vaccination requirements, another was public school curriculum. Kirby said teachers are, quote, being forced to push the left's agenda, the government's agenda within the war on traditional families with such things as promoting transgenderism, homosexuality in our classrooms. These policies are sold to the American public, end of quote. No, you are a transphobe, homophobe piece of shit. That is what you are. The bill stipulates that the government would not be able to substantially burden someone's constitutional right to freedom of religion unless doing so, quote, in a particular situation is essential to further a compelling governmental interest, end of quote. Yeah, how about separation of church and state? Or is that no longer a compelling governmental interest? In cases where the government can prove to the courts there is a compelling interest to restrict that right, government officials must demonstrate that religious freedoms are being infringed upon in, quote, the least restrictive means possible, end of quote. At least 23 other states have religious freedom restoration acts like the one being proposed in West Virginia. The laws are modeled after the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, signed in 1993 by then-President Bill Clinton, which allows federal regulations that interfere with religious beliefs to be challenged. Yeah, once again, a conservative in liberal clothing. Eli Baumwell, Advocacy Director and Interim Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of West Virginia, said the 1993 federal law was designed to protect people, especially religious minorities, from laws that affected their ability to engage in personal practices of their faith. He said similar laws that have been passed by states in the years since have been applied very differently. Baumwell, whose organization is opposed to the bill, said, quote, unfortunately, people have seized upon a good idea and turned a shield into a sword. RFRAs today are promoted by organizations and ideologies and aren't concerned about individual religious observances. They're focused on circumventing laws that require fair and equal treatment. End of quote. A similar bill failed in 2016 in West Virginia after lawmakers voiced concerns about how it could affect LGBTQ residents. Then Senate Majority Leader Mitch Carmichael wiped away tears on the Senate floor as he spoke in support of the Democratic proposed amendment that would bar the legislation from being used to discriminate against LGBTQ people. In 2016, there were 64 Republicans and 36 Democrats in the West Virginia House of Delegates. In 2023, the Republican majority has expanded to 88 seats, only 12 Democrats in the House. Before advancing this year's bill to the Senate, Republican lawmakers rejected a similar Democratic proposed amendment to the one passed in 2016 with little discussion Monday. It would have protected non-discrimination laws or ordinances that protect LGBTQ groups and residents. Judiciary Vice Chair Republican Tom Fast said changes to the bill were unnecessary. He said the bill, quote, does not determine who is a winner and loser and does not create a license to discriminate, end of quote. Oh, really? Democratic delegate Joey Garcia wasn't buying it. He said of the Democrats' amendment, quote, it would not have hurt the bill if that were really true, end of quote. Democrats later proposed a different addition to the bill that would require businesses to put a sign on their door notifying the public if they refuse to provide service to a specific group of people because of their religious beliefs. The amendment stipulated that any business that failed to display a sign and refused service to someone on religious grounds could face a maximum fine of $200. Democratic delegate Mike Pushkin said, quote, I think it's important that we let the public know exactly who the bigots are, end of quote. The amendment was rejected after Kirby likened the proposal to the anti-Semitic laws in Nazi Germany that required people to identify themselves as Jewish. He called the amendment disheartening and called it a trick that would lead to violence and attacks. From the party that would have supported the Nazis. Unbelievable. I gotta quit or I'm gonna get really, really pissed off. Speaking of bigots, let's go to our next segment.
Stop! Hammer time!
Oh yeah, it's hammer time. It is time to drop the hammer on the douchebag of the week. And the winner this week, Scott Adams of the Dilbert comics. Let's go to this story. This is David Bowder writing for the Associated Press out of New York. This is dated February 27th. The comic strip Dilbert disappeared with lightning speed following racist remarks by creator Scott Adams. But it shouldn't come as a shock to anyone who has followed them both. Adams, who is white, was an outspoken presence on social media long before describing black people as a hate group on YouTube. And to some, Dilbert had strayed from its roots as a chronicler of office culture. The editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, which dumped Dilbert last year, said the comic strip, quote, went from being hilarious to being hurtful and mean, end of quote. The Los Angeles Times, which joined dozens of other newspapers in dropping the comic following last week's remarks, had quietly replaced 4 of Adams's strips last year. Mike Peterson, columnist for the industry blog The Daily Cartoonist, said, quote, he kind of ran out of office jokes and started integrating all this other stuff, so after a while, it became hard to distinguish between Scott Adams and Dilbert, end of quote. As individual newspapers told readers they were dropping Dilbert, the company that distributed the strip, Andrews McMeel Universal, said it was severing ties with Adams. By Monday, Dilbert was gone from the Go Comics site, which also features many top comics such as Peanuts and Calvin and Hobbes. Peterson said that Dilbert is effectively dead. Adams said Monday on YouTube that his distributor didn't really have a choice because clients and other cartoonists were mad. He said, quote, they were just forced into it, end of quote. On Twitter, he said his book publisher and book agent had canceled him. The Penguin Random House imprint portfolio said it wouldn't publish Adams's book Reframe Your Brain in September, according to the Wall Street Journal. Adams has long been active on Twitter, whose CEO Elon Musk was among the few to publicly back him. He also blogs regularly and puts out a regular podcast on YouTube. He's attracted attention for comments he's made in the past, including saying in 2011 that women are treated differently by society for the same reason as children and the mentally disabled. Quote, it's just easier this way for everyone, end of quote. He said that 2016 Republican presidential candidate Carly Fiorina had, quote, an angry wife face, end of quote. Adams became a vocal supporter of Donald Trump, saying that Trump had a hypnotist's skill in attracting followers. He said that stance cost him money in lost speakers' fees. Good, I don't care. He said he lost the primetime animated Dilbert series that ran on UPN for 2 seasons for being white, when the network decided to target a black audience and that he lost 2 other corporate jobs because of his race. Bullshit! That is a lie. During the February 22nd episode of his YouTube podcast, he referenced a Rasmussen Report survey that had asked whether people agreed with the statement, "It's okay to be white." Most people agreed, but Adams noted that 26% of black respondents disagreed and others weren't sure. The Anti-Defamation League said the phrase at the center of the question was popularized as a trolling campaign by members of 4chan, a notorious anonymous message board, and was adopted by some white supremacists. Rasmussen Reports is a conservative polling firm that has used its Twitter account to endorse false and misleading claims about COVID-19 vaccines, elections, and the January 6, 2021 traitorous attack on the U.S. Capitol. I added traitorous. Adams repeatedly referred to people who are black as members of a hate group or a racist hate group and said he would no longer help black Americans. On his podcast Monday, he called his hate group remark hyperbole, but continued to defend his advice that white people get the hell away from blacks. Yes, he really said this. In announcing that Dilbert would be cut from the Kansas City Star, the newspaper's community engagement editor, Derek Donovan, said Adams's, quote, antagonistic, childishly macho persona, end of quote, has been a constant for years. Editor Richard Green of the Santa Rosa Press Democrat in California said, quote, it's not cancel culture, it's doing the right thing, end of quote. The Sun Chronicle in Attleboro, Massachusetts left a blank space Monday where Dilbert would normally run and said it would keep it that way through March, quote, as a reminder of the racism that pervades our society, end of quote. The San Francisco Chronicle stopped publishing Dilbert last October, a move that drew only a handful of complaints. Editor-in-chief Emilio Garcia Ruiz said in the newspaper that he objected to a strip that said in an effort to diversify workplaces that straight men should pretend to be gay. In a September 2nd Dilbert strip, a boss said that traditional performance reviews would be replaced by a wokeness score. When an employee complained that could be subjective, the boss said, quote, that'll cost you 2 points off your wokeness score, bigot, end of quote. In an August strip, the boss said the company was getting into the pandemic prevention market and creating demand by unleashing a deadly virus. A black employee featured in an October 20th strip noted that his boss ignored his actual accomplishments to recommend him for a job for which he was not qualified. The employee backed down when told it would be a big jump in pay. Peterson said there are other examples of how Adams's attitudes had replaced the biting humor that Peterson and a legion of middle managers loved. Adams seemed to run out of jokes. Peterson said, quote, the strip jumped the shark, end of quote. So to Scott Adams, we have this message for you.
Don't be a douchebag.
Yeah, you got that right. Hey, Scott, I tell you what, I'll issue the challenge to you that I've issued to others. Charity boxing match. If I win, you get to pay money to the ACLU and a trans group of my choice. How does that sound? Want to put your money where your mouth is there, bub? I'll tell you what, I'm up for the challenge, and I'll bring it on. You just watch me. That's going to be it for this week. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson. Please support independent media, the First Amendment, and a woman's right to choose.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.